Welcome back. For the next hour, we will listen to the first panel discussion of today, Technology Alliances, Response to Geopolitical Tensions. The digital domain is not only bringing an entire panoply of cyber threats, but also creating space for global struggle, for influence, and for domination. Increasing strategic competition between global powers can have a tremendous impact for the future of the world. In this context, it seems crucial for like-minded countries to work closely together in order to ensure that further digital development is based on shared values. All these questions will be discussed by our distinguished speakers. Let me introduce you to Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones, member of the UK House of Lords and former Minister of State for Security and Counter-Terrorism of the UK. Robert Strayer, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and International Communications and Information Policy at the US Department of State. Sir Julian King, former Commissioner for the Security Union. Wiktor Staniecki, Head of Cyber Sector at the Security Policy Division of the European External Action Service. Marta Poślad, Director of the CE Government Affairs at Google. And the session will be moderated by Dr. Joanna Świątkowska, Senior Research Fellow of the Kosciuszko Institute and former Cybersec Program Director. Small note to our audience before giving the floor to Joanna. Please remember that you can use the Q&A box in order to ask the questions. Our speakers can answer them typing the message directly in the box, or the moderator of the session can decide on answering it live. We deeply encourage you to get involved in our discussion. Joanna, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Basia. I hope you can hear me well. So good morning one more time. My name is Joanna Świątkowska, and indeed I'm initiator and former program director of Cybersec. I would like to also stress that currently I'm an assistant professor at AGH University of Science and Technology. So I would like to first and foremost welcome our great guests. And before I will go to the merits of the debate, I would like to stress some technical details, meaning that we will start with a round of questions to all our great speakers. And afterwards, I will, of course, wholeheartedly encourage you to participate in a debate by asking questions. You have a chat at your disposal. I will be monitoring all the questions, and after the first round of opening remarks, I will be more than thrilled to pass them to our speakers, hoping that it will be a starting point for a very vivid discussion. So in a few words, I would like to say that the main goal of this session is to discuss the nexus of technology and geopolitics. And I believe that it won't be an exaggeration if I will say that a few weeks ago, when the Cybersec team put together this session, we truly lived in a different reality. And of course, I mean, even back then, we knew very well that technology is an essential ingredient of our political, economic, societal reality. And of course, a strong factor that influences the whole global order. And actually, the 5G issue that shaped key geopolitical processes and relations among great powers serves as a great example and illustration to this conviction. But I do believe that today we live in a different reality, and I'm not afraid to say that the pandemic has already changed our lives, basically. And even though there are many uncertainties ahead of us, I think that there is one thing that we can be sure, and that is that the technology the role of technology and its impact will only increase, and it will have tremendous impact on the emerging new global order. So to me, in this context, those circumstances must set the tone for this debate, for this discussion. And since we have top-notch experts coming from various fields, I truly hope that we will be able to discuss those challenges from various perspectives. And by doing that, we will provide the Institute with a set of great recommendations that will be promoted afterwards. All right, so I think we are ready to go, and I would like to start with a first question that will be directed at Ms. Poślad. I hope you are with us. Oh yes, okay, I can see you. Good morning one more time. Good morning. So actually, amid the crisis, we can clearly see that new technologies already have proved that they can serve as a backbone for societal, economic, and political processes. Basically, as we can see even today, our lives, our businesses moved to cyberspace. And for me, what is especially interesting is the fact that the private sector is really trying to assist governments in overcoming various challenges, starting with helping to strengthen educational processes, to also countering together disinformation campaigns, at least to some extent, so on and so forth. And one of the consequences of this crisis for me will be even faster, even more intense digital revolution. It means that the role of the private companies, the role of the tech sector will only increase. And the question is, does it mean that along with gaining more power and more influence, the private sector will also gain greater responsibility? In other words, what will be the role of the private sector on this brand new geopolitical chessboard? Over to you, Marta.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and good morning, everyone. I've had a lot of firsts in the past 2 weeks. This is the first live panel debate I've been participating in, so congratulations to the whole Cybersec team for putting this together at such a challenging time. Let me start with this. Google's mission has always been to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. That has been also our priority in the past 2 weeks. That mission hasn't been changing, but the demand has required us to be even better, more intense, more present with that premise of the existence of Google. And this also really frames how we think about the future. On the other hand, it feels like planning and thinking much ahead at this point is very, very difficult. I think we're all getting a sense that we're still in the middle or approaching the end of the beginning. That will likely define what's in store for us in the future. In the past weeks, when we've been actively engaged into COVID-19 crisis response, we haven't discovered new responsibilities. We haven't discovered new developments. They just all came at a very enhanced pace, at a very enhanced intensity, and that indeed required us to maximize showcasing our responsibility and making sure that we can provide the best user experience throughout the world. It's been a challenging time also for a company that needs to balance the well-being of thousands of employees and our users, but we don't feel we've witnessed new types or new models or new skills we would need to acquire. We just got proven right that what we've been working on for years is what we need today, and likely what we need more going forward. Much of what we see, and much of what will stick with us for months and years to come, is that the plethora of technological tools is available. It's not always accompanied with required skills. So before we think about further leaps in the framework of education, remote work, design, many of those tools are already right there, and now a big challenge will be to provide people with necessary digital skills. That's where I see the responsibility, certainly, and a certain increase required. I think when it comes to our responsibility and when it comes to what's the role of private sector in this whole story, I think it's also good to look at how much cooperation has been going on between tech companies, individual governments, international organizations in making sure that we're providing the right information, that we're prioritizing right, which is really telling about how still limited we are in the discourse where what others would like to see our predominant role. And I think this conversation today is happening at a very interesting time, as I said at the beginning, because I feel it's a very early stage to discuss what's in store for us. But one thing for sure, the focus now needs to be on just getting our core job done well.
Thank you so much for this answer, Marta. And actually, a very quick follow-up question, because you mentioned that what you observe is the fact that we will need to even stronger educate the users of the technology. So my question is, do you think that political leaders, because you mentioned private-public cooperation, were they ready to start cooperating with the usage of digital tools and digital solutions right away in a time where it was truly needed? Do you have this feeling that here we are at the right stage?
So myself with my team, we work with 10 governments across Central and Eastern Europe, and I have to say, and I've been at Google for 8 years. So I have to say I've been quite amazed at how smooth this cooperation has grown. I remember beginning in 2012 at Google, where my first task was to work with governments on setting up their Google Plus account. And in the past 2 weeks, we've been all discussing very advanced solutions, regardless the basics. As you know, Google has been doing the minimum of what we can do, making sure that the right information is displayed on our platforms. But a ton of work has been also happening around how can Google Cloud be used for telemedicine? How can we scale educational tools just beyond getting schools signed up? I think in CEE we're actually in a very good spot. I can't speak for the rest of the European Union or other global or other international governments, but even looking at infrastructure, CEE has currently a number of advantages. One of them is the new infrastructure, for example, where I think we are at ease when it comes to managing the new load on the bandwidth and capabilities. Secondly, this is a very much leapfrogging region. Many of the processes are already in many ways digitized because they didn't know the paper ones before. This region is known for a very quick development of fintech and consumer contactless payments. So I think with that in mind, we've been lucky to really work with thought leaders on the other side, to work with teams that are very competitive to private sector teams that understand, that come to us, that challenge us, which is also nice to see, where we've got great partners to work with on the government side. So I think the challenge here is that since coronavirus development was so unforeseen, nobody was prepped. So we're also at the time of discovering new ways of how we can work together, also recognizing the regulatory boundaries that are out there. And as much as that debate wasn't resonating the first 2 weeks, I think that's going to be the focus of this week and the following week and the week after. How do we value various ideals attached to the free flow of information online?
Thank you so much. I think that this is an excellent introduction to the next questions that I have. And actually, I would like to move to this global dimension and direct the next question to Ambassador Rob Strayer, because, sir, the current crisis will surely inevitably revolutionize the global architecture of supply chains, including, of course, the technological value chain. And I believe that we as the international community, we will have to face a very difficult question, actually, how to organize the system all over again. I mean, which model to adopt? Because on the one side, I can see that it can be kind of paradoxically maybe an opportunity to invest in new solutions, new alliances that will put security and trust at the center, at the heart of technology. But on the other hand, we know that for sure that various actors will struggle heavily with upcoming economic breakdown, upcoming economic crisis, and they might want to look for more accessible, more affordable, sometimes maybe less secure solutions. And actually 5G related choices might be first in line in here. So my question to you, sir, is how do you see that? How do you see the upcoming technological landscape, and how it will affect a geopolitical situation? Over to you, sir.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Cybersec for organizing this, and Joanna, thank you very much for that question and for organizing this panel.
Thank you so much for being with us at 5 a.m. I guess it's 5 a.m. in DC.
That's right. That's right. Yeah,
happy
to do it. I didn't have to travel far to get to do the call. So as we look at the long-term, I think trend is that people around the world will continue to demand that their individual liberties be protected as more and more of what's important to us goes online. As just an example of, as 5G develops more, it's going to create more and more data. That data is going to be processed through in some cases, forms of artificial intelligence. And that's going to empower all kinds of critical infrastructure, from autonomous vehicles, the telemedicine, the sensors, the diagnostics, and even potentially in the future remote surgeries are going to be empowered by 5G technology, as well as all our traditional forms of critical infrastructure, like the production of electricity and distribution of electricity and water. So as that becomes more and more important and more personal data is involved, people are going to demand that their fundamental individual liberties are protected by the suppliers of that technology. And the suppliers of technology have very important roles in the process. They are in the most trusted positions because they're supplying this in the supply chain, this critical technology that is the platform for so many other services that are in the higher levels of that value chain that right on top of it. So when it comes to effectuating those individual liberties and those being protected, it's important that those companies be headquartered in countries that value the rule of law, that have a rule of law system where there's an independent judiciary. Without independent judiciaries and democratic processes, we really can't expect that individual liberties will be vindicated and will be maintained over the long run. So it's really going to be important, I think, that we as democratic valuing citizens around the world are going to insist that our technologies that provide such very critical parts of our technology for our daily lives are coming from vendors that are providing products and services from countries that are upholding our views about rule of law and individual liberties. It's going to be also very important that there be transparency about how those companies operate. So the best way to get transparency is to have a company that's publicly traded, as a public board of directors that has to respond to transparent rules about its financial activities, about its compliance with intellectual property right protection laws, as well as about protections on anti-corruption, or having a good practice internally to avoid corrupt practices, so it doesn't become a problem throughout a company where they have corrupt practices around the world. I think in the long run, to answer part of your question, is hopefully, actually in the short run, hopefully we have a quick recovery after this. So there's not tremendous pressure for countries to go with very cheap technologies, and that they can value these important other factors that include how their data is going to be protected in a rule of law system, as well as cybersecurity protections. I would just point out that I think that in many cases there are very comparable cost points for in the 5G realm between Huawei and between Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung. There's not a large difference in price. To the extent there is a difference in price, it's being driven by a subsidy model that China perpetuates. That is, they have massive state subsidies to their both state companies as well as to their private companies. They also provide massive subsidies through the Chinese Export-Import Bank and through the Chinese Development Bank to really reduce the cost of deployment of technology. And they also are able to subsidize because companies like Huawei and ZTE have probably more than 90% of the Chinese market, leaving less than, it looks like 7% based on last quarter data to Ericsson and Nokia within China. So they're able to subsidize from within and then use that to help drive pricing models outside of China. I think, as I said at the beginning, it's going to be a long-term trend, I think, toward a higher a demand by the public for higher quality technology in the form of what values underpin it. We're already seeing democracies work very closely together, and just two examples I might give to that would be one, the United States and the countries in Europe talked closely, as well as it inevitably being the decision of Europeans to develop their 5G security toolbox, which was released at the end of January, but based on an important risk assessment last October, reflecting, I think, our Western shared values about that there are, of course, cybersecurity best practices that can be deployed in 5G networks, but also non-technical measures that apply to the supply chain itself, recognizing that a software or hardware vendor can update its technology in that supply chain in the form of software updates that can introduce compromises into networks that could never be fully protected against by analyzing source code. That means that you have to have a trust relationship between the vendor and the telecom operator and the public where that technology is being deployed. So that risk assessment and then the ultimate security toolbox in January recognize that there are going to be high risk vendors that are defined as suppliers that are not based in countries that have a rule of law system, and that where there are questions potentially about the ownership structure of those companies. And so that toolbox then said that those high-risk vendors should not be deployed on critical or sensitive parts of networks. And in our United States, there's no part of the network that's not sensitive where there's processing or storage of important data and information. The second example I'd give for how democracies have come together to demand this higher standard for emerging technology is with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Europe's AI principles that were released last May. So there, more than 40 countries had worked for the better part of a year to develop principles that included democratic values that I've mentioned, individual liberties, privacy, security, and safety, as well as the explainability of AI models as being important principles that should be part of how we see AI deployed in our nations. That's been further expanded upon just in last month in February with the launch of a policy observatory, which is going to be a way to objectively monitor how countries are moving forward to deploy principles of trust with regard to artificial intelligence. So those are two ways we've seen, I think, in the last case, full global engagement among democracies. In the other case of European countries coming together and to develop the common principles that will ensure trust in future technology. So with that, I'll leave it there and thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, many interesting points that I would like to follow up later on, of course. starting with the question whether we truly be able to go through this stress test among related to the cooperation between us as transatlantic partners, and also some good points about the potential bottom-up pressure related with the values and how it can influence our also political technological choices. I will come back to that when I will ask question to Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones a little bit. But before that, I would like to turn to Sir Julian King. Sir, I hope that you can hear me, because I mean, we said many times, even during this conversation, that the current crisis is clearly redefining geopolitical relations, roles, and responsibilities of various players. And paradoxically, this reorganization might bring some opportunities for some players, including European Union, actually. And Ambassador Strayer just mentioned EU 5G toolbox and some other initiatives that are being created. And that's why I would like to ask you, from the perspective of the former commissioner, do you think that this might be a chance to truly invest and build the European strategic digital autonomy, or maybe the momentum is gone, or maybe we had our chance a few months ago before the crisis, but right now it's just impossible because we need to focus on some other aspects? So, but if the answer will be a little bit more positive, then my question is, how should we do that? Like, what will be the crucial factor for the success? So over to you, sir. And my question is whether, Sir Julian King, are you with us?
Hello.
Hello, good morning.
Thank you. Good morning. I heard your question. I want to start by saying something about this idea of autonomy in this area, or more generally, strategic autonomy. I think it's very important as we think about these issues to remember that autonomy is not the same as autarky.
Yeah.
So autonomy is about having the capacity to act in accordance with your own objectives, your own norms, not to be coerced, not to find yourself under pressure or influence. And President Macron spoke about this when he said that, you know, as Europeans, it surely isn't right to be dependent upon norms or values that are generated somewhere else, nor is it right to be dependent upon other people investing in your infrastructure, old-fashioned infrastructure or critical digital infrastructure, China or anywhere else. And it's not right to be subject to outside influence, such as disinformation, whether that is pro-Kremlin disinformation or from any other source. So it's to avoid being in that kind of dependent situation that people talk about the importance of autonomy. That is not the same as autarky, cutting yourself off completely, seeking somehow to have complete and total independence from interaction with other partners. That's neither realistic nor desirable. So as we try and tackle some of these issues, and 5G is one example, but there'll be lots of other issues that come up quite quickly, we have to look at ways of being independent of unwelcome outside influence, while still maintaining a network of contact and cooperation with our allies and partners and like-minded countries. And I think that's what we tried to do when we did the 5G toolbox that Robert was just talking about, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in detail, I'm sure. But I think it also has to influence how we think about the impact of what we're going through at the moment, this whole COVID crisis. As we try and process that and look ahead, there have been people who've said it's going to lead to questions about the nature of globalization. People who've said it's going to lead to a sort of geopolitical shift, perhaps with the West suffering at the expense of the East. It's certainly going to strengthen the role of the state. And as you've observed, it's certainly going to also mean that more and more of life shifts online. And as we deal with those challenges, those geopolitical challenges, what do we want by way of globalization in the future? What's the West going to do about that? How are we going to work with the state, and what kind of state do we want? And what's the role of digital technology in all of that? We should be, as Europeans, I believe, open to the fullest possible cooperation with partners, allies, and like-minded countries. We're going to have to work together to deal with a series of challenges. Some of those challenges are direct security challenges. And as you have outlined so far in the conference this morning, finding ways of building trust and confidence and maintaining trust and confidence is going to be crucial. That's trust and confidence in our critical digital infrastructure. It's trust and confidence about what happens over that infrastructure. So avoiding abuse, whether that's criminal or political, through disinformation, and unfortunately we're seeing quite a lot of disinformation at the moment, but also on content, how we're going to deal with other forms of harmful content. I believe that we can make progress on all of those objectives, not in a closed way, not by cutting ourselves off, but by building a wider network of cooperation. Robert gave a couple of good examples just now, with our partners and allies, in order to establish together the kind of society that we want based on our shared values to deal with some of these shared challenges.
Thank you so much. I mean, these are incredibly important words, because I mean, even the title of this session indicates that we at the Kosciuszko Institute, we do agree and we do believe that only by acting together we are able to overcome those not easy challenges. And you, sir, you mentioned norms and principles and the role of it in the future decisions. And actually, this is a good segue to my next question that I would like to address to Baroness Pauline Neville-Jones. Because I mean, the COVID-19 outbreak proves that new technologies might significantly help to increase efficiency and precision of our responses. I mean, many examples can be given, starting with understanding better how the disease spreads, better informing people, so on and so forth. But we are also starting to notice that because of the tremendous power given by the technology, there is this temptation to overuse it. Because, to put it in a different way, we can be seduced by the promise of solving very difficult challenges with easy means. And we might reach for technology too fast, too extensively, without thinking about the far-reaching consequences. And of course, there are various models how technology might be used. Some people even say that we are already observing this race between so-called authoritarian versus democratic digitalization. And my question to you, Madam, is what are your predictions about Europe and like-minded countries? Because we are also talking about the cooperation here. How should we develop and use technology so we will not compromise the fundamental rights and the democratic values? Or maybe it's too late, or maybe we just need to sacrifice some of them. Over to you, Madam.
I think it's never too late. You may not be as far ahead as you should be, but I think it's never ever too late. And the questions you're asking are absolutely key. And of course, they're highly political. Let's just go through some of the things that you said. I mean, you started by saying, that technology has increased the efficiency and the precision of our response to COVID-19. And there are areas where you can really point to that. I mean, you can see in the modeling that's being used about the spread of the pandemic, the use of AI, and indeed of quite advanced uses of technology and machine-led learning. It's also being used, obviously, in biomedicine. And there's no doubt the pandemic will speed our ability to use these technologies, usefully in that sort of area very greatly. We will learn a great deal. I think it's probably fair to say that some of the ways in which technology is being used have been better demonstrated in Asia than they have in Europe. And I think that one of the things we learned from that is that you need to be prepared. And you will use technology much better if you've already thought about the ways in which you need to use it. And I think there's little doubt that in some Asian countries, we see the results of having taken the lessons from the SARS epidemic and prepared the country for future-like situations. So one of my conclusions is you use technology better when you've actually planned and thought about what kind of facilities you need, and you build in a combination of good planning and the use of technology that is related to it. So the next question you asked was, well, what about the liberal democracies? Are we resorting to using technology without thinking through the implications? And certainly, we can see we have resorted in an emergency to pretty authoritarian means of actually running our societies. And we recognize the need for that. But clearly, that is open to potential abuse. Legislation has been put through in a lot of places, including London, which authorize the state to engage in very authoritarian activity and control our lives. I think we can rely reasonably on the ability of our societies and the desire to revert to normal norms when the emergency is over. But I think we should be careful about thinking that it will be exactly the same. Because one of the functions of technology in all of this is that it makes your ability to actually exercise these authoritarian measures more efficiently. Think about frontier control, for instance. It's much easier to exercise efficient frontier control if you have the technology that enables you to do that. We see it in daily life in China, but it's also going to be true here. Will we, good question, it seems to me, revert to completely open frontiers after the pandemic is over? I wonder. So I think there are some real questions about the extent to which it'll be exactly the same, and that we will assume exactly the same posture. Because I suspect in the back of our minds, we will have the thought, perhaps we need these powers. So there's going to be a need for great balance. And I entirely agree with Julian King when he said the state is going to get bigger. I think that is probably baked into the future situation. And if the state is going to get bigger, it's going to be doing more regulating. It in turn needs to be regulated. So we have, I think, new challenges in the way we run the whole question of the relationship between the state and the individual. And the private sector is going to be an important part of that, because the private sector is often the solutions provider. It's the technological means. So it has to be all three parties understanding and sharing, sharing the same objectives and indeed sharing the values. So now we come to perhaps the last and the biggest of your questions really as well. What are we going to do in the future? And what about our attitude to the use of technology and China? And I listen to what Robert Strayer says, and I agree with a great deal of it. I think that there is, however, an argument to be had about the whole question of what constitutes the really core networks. I'm not one of those who thinks that it's a good idea to go down a road where, if we can avoid it, we end up with a great decoupling of the relationship between China and the Western democracies. So I think it's a danger. So what should we try and do? I think the moves that we're making gradually towards trying to develop a set of values which we then relate to our use of technology is extremely valuable. It's an important part of having a joint strategy. That joint strategy is only going to be really effective if we manage to carry it on a transatlantic basis. One of the things that worries me at the moment is the way in which that is not happening, and it needs to happen. So I think that is a very important part of trying to get both a code by which we all live in the democracy, and at the same time actually managing, I would hope, to maintain at least a commercial relationship with China. But it's going to be under pressure, I think, and I think globalization is going to be under pressure. Give you an example. I read that 97% of antibiotics that are sold in the United States are produced in China. I don't think any country, I certainly wouldn't regard that situation in the UK as being acceptable. So there will be pressure for reshoring. There will be pressure for relocalization of activity. There will be pressure for actually drawing back from where we are in globalization. And it's how we actually manage, I think, to do those things which reduce dependence. And I think dependence is an issue here. How we reduce dependence at the same time, we don't smash up a great deal of the structure that we have built and which maintains both commerce, prosperity, and indeed a reasonable degree of political peace in the world. So we have, I think COVID-19 doesn't create these things, but it brings them together in a way which creates a degree of realization and pressure on us now to begin to actually unravel some of these problems and solve them over time.
Thank you so much. I mean, to some extent, it's a little bit worrying that it takes the pandemic to understand those critical dependencies and challenges that actually already exist. But certainly, this is the whole great topic for the further discussion. I can see that we are receiving some questions at the Q&A chat, and I promise that we will get back to it, at least for the last 10 minutes of this session. But right now, I would like to, of course, ask the last question to Mr. Wiktor Staniecki, and it's going to be a question about digital diplomacy in the times of pandemic. And it's not going to be an easy question, unfortunately, because I mean, on the one hand, we can clearly see that European Union is talking very strongly about norms and values that should govern cyberspace. We believe in open, free, and secure internet. But recently we saw that opposite points of view regarding the nature of cyberspace are gaining distraction. More and more we hear that that it's hard to understand for people. It's hard to translate those high-level words, open and free, into very concrete actions. And especially in times like this, in the times of crisis, people and entities, they want to have those clear messages, effective solutions. It just can be much more appealing to various stakeholders. So as a consequence, those pragmatic visions, which are different and sometimes far away from our values, they might just receive disadvantage. So in my opinion, if the European Union will fail to convince the world that the value-based cyberspace is something that we should all strive for, we might end up in a completely different geotechnological reality. So how can EU and like-minded countries strengthen their soft power? In other words, how can we build narratives that will convince people that cyberspace that we believe in should prevail? Difficult question, but I hope, Wiktor, that is going to be a starting point for a very interesting answer.
Thank you very much, and I hope indeed I will be able to reply to your answers. First of all, let me start by also welcoming other panelists. It's a great pleasure and honor to be among you, and thank you very much for GlobalSec and Kosciuszko Institute for organizing this event. Boldly moving in that completely into cyberspace. I think it's we are definitely in these days living a lot of unprecedented changes, and I think that I feel a little bit too early to say what will happen next. As Marta said, I think that we're still at the end of the beginning rather than at the end of the tunnel. But discussing these issues and sort of trying to preempt a little bit of what's going to be next and how we want to already start preparing our joint action and collaboration to tackle some of the challenges mentioned by previous panelists is important. So I've heard a lot of repetitions on words about collaboration, and that we are all in that together. And I think that I couldn't agree more. I think that this this crisis also shows us that that as with other ongoing crises like climate change or stability of cyberspace, in a way maybe not in a crisis mode, but we definitely, it shows that only by working together and collaborating we can find a global solution to global problems. And in that sense, and I'll get into the norms and values part of your question. But I think that a lot of strengths that the European Union has been embarking on for several years, and Commissioner King mentioned some of them, were so right. I think that work and push towards the greater preparedness, greater resiliency of cyberspace and our digital infrastructure is so important. I think that now we can see a lot of that this functions. There have been recently, I think on Friday last week, a meeting of the NIST contract, Network Information Security Directive contact group that brought together a number of stakeholders, both from the EU institutions, but also from the EU member states, to discuss, to take stock of the threats landscape, to see what's going on in terms of, in the moments where our digital infrastructure is so key to daily functioning of our administrations, businesses, and also communication of our citizens. That it's there. We had also worked on the GDPR data protection work that I think that will be very important framework to rely on when a lot of questions that Baroness Neville-Jones mentioned about role of states, surveillance technologies, and the role of individuals in all that comes to play. And then digital autonomy or diversification of supply chains that Commissioner King mentioned, that's a key element as well. And I think that it was rightly stressed that indeed it is not about autarky. It's not about creating a independency from the global chains. This is not the way forward. It will not be functioning. But I think that we have to think more and broader, how we diversify, how we also make sure that if there is a crisis in one area, we have other sources that we can draw on, and also channels of cooperation and with our allies and partners that we can get support from. So this brings me into your question about norms, and I think that in these times we don't need less norms, we need more values and norms. And I think that this the engagement that the European Union has been already doing for several months and years in the processes, multilateral processes such as the open-ended working group on cyber issues and the group of governmental experts, it's so key to continue. And I think that precisely highlighting the fact that we all need open, free, stable, and secure cyberspace for the benefit of our businesses, for the benefit of our citizens, and also for international community to cooperate is key. And it's clear that unfortunate crises such as COVID-19 are being used by malicious actors, be it criminals or some state-sponsored actors to make advancements and maybe bring be it monetary gains or strategic gains, but it's also clearly shows that we need more of discussions and reliance on existing frameworks, such as international law, such as universal norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace in these times, to help those perpetrators or malicious actors accountable, and safeguard the stability and openness of the internet. And in that part, working on resilience and supporting supporting other actors through capacity building. So this is one of the key elements that the European Union has been leading and will lead on for the benefit of everybody is crucial. And I'll stop here.
Okay, thank you so much for this encouraging answer, sir. So before, I mean, we'll see if we will have time for my follow-up questions, because I can see that we have plenty of questions coming from the audience, and I will try to at least turn to some of them. We have still 10 minutes, okay, so there is one question, the first one that we actually received, and it comes like this. One of the things that comes in mind in this COVID pandemic is the actual possibility of users to create cyberspace digital voting systems. Will such a performance be possible with the current state of technology? I wonder if there is something, if it is something that maybe, Wiktor, you can refer to, because I mean, maybe not in the context of voting, because I know that this is not the scope of your interest, but we do hear that the European Union is trying to develop more secure channels of communication, investing more heavily on encryption parts of the solution. So my question is to you, whether you think that this is a good time to exercise this or maybe push forward some ideas for more secure solutions, also in context of the technological aspects. Maybe you do have also some reflections on the voting system.
Well,
yes.
Of course, you know, I mean, those will be mainly my personal reflections. I think that of course, there's like short term and long term. I think that in the short term, of course, you know, many, and we could see that through debates ongoing in many of our member states, such as France, who recently held the first part of the local elections, or the discussions about the upcoming presidential elections in Poland. You know, many of these questions, if we would have a secure and a proper functioning way of voting via electronic means or from distance, could be solved probably. But I'm not, you know, I'm not qualified to talk about technology that stands behind that. But I think that where my interest comes and what would be important is that, you know, for that to happen, and for what we have seen already last year with the European Parliament elections, and the increased drive for security measures, for that, we would also need a very robust adherence to norms of responsible state behavior, that we don't have other actors that would use such opportunities, that would be you know, any kinds of possible gaps, security gaps in the voting systems, to be used for malicious purposes. So I think that it just strengthened again the need for international community to really apply the existing norms that are out there and agreed by the General Assembly in the forms of various group of governmental experts reports and different UN General Assembly resolutions, to apply them in practice.
Thank you so much for that, Wiktor. And actually, I can see that there are at least a few questions to Ambassador Schreier. So I will try to take them together, starting with the first one. Sir, what are your views on the idea of the technological decoupling in terms of software in China? It looks like it already happened. Do you think it will happen also with regards to hardware supply chains, for instance, semiconductors? And in this context, I would like to also maybe read another question, which goes like this. Recent estimates of China's market of 5G NR equipment show European players Ericsson at 3.9% and Nokia at 1.4% of market share. Should the EU Commission address this issue of limited market access with its Chinese counterparts And if so, what are the appropriate steps, measures, and tools that Commission should use? So maybe those two questions, if I can ask Ambassador Strayer and Commissioner King to maybe reflect on that, I would be very grateful.
Great. If let me begin with our limited time, I'll cover the first question and maybe defer to Commissioner King on the second one about the European trade relations. I see on the first point, I think that's really, the ball is in the court of the Chinese and Chinese companies about whether there's going to be further decoupling with respect to hardware. On the software side, it's clear it's not a fair playing field. Our companies that are not willing to arbitrarily censor content are being excluded from China. If they're not willing to follow the mandates of the Chinese Communist Party with regard to content, they're being excluded. So then with regard to the hardware, I think there are going to be increasing questions about whether that can be trusted if companies are not transparent about what is the role of the Chinese Communist Party in their company, what commands come from the top down, given there's no rule of law system there. I think that we're also going to see questions about how are those hardware and software companies in China participating in authoritarian activities hand in hand with the Chinese government, both in the provinces like the Xinjiang province and outside of China as well. How are they exporting that technology? I think that from a human rights perspective, companies, wherever they are in the world, as well as governments, should have huge concern that they're basically subsidizing human rights violators in the form of Huawei's activities in Xinjiang, which is well documented by the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. It goes back for at least a few years of coordination on things like safe cities, establishing a intelligent security innovation center in Xinjiang, as well as working very closely with the Public Security Bureau. That says to me that they're very active in this repression that's occurred with more than 1 million Uyghurs. So I think companies in China will have to answer for their activities there and have to be transparent for there to be any comfort for those that care about human rights and democratic values to want to do business with them. So I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Could you please take the second question? We do have 3 minutes to go.
Right. Thank you. Well, on China, the Europeans set out last year an approach to China, which I thought was quite sensible and comprehensive, which says that, of course, while we're going to continue to partner with China in some areas, tackling climate change, for example, we have to recognize that we compete economically. And in some ways, we are rivals when it comes to values and norms that have underpinned this whole debate. And that approach is going to be reflected in how we deal with China on a range of issues, but also on these issues of technology. Going forward, I think that we will see a stronger focus on a notion of reciprocity. So how open are respective markets and around fairness of trade. So what is the role of state subsidies and what is the role of state-run enterprises? Those factors are going to become more important. But I just wanted to say something about decoupling as well, if I may. I mean, decoupling is happening to an extent. If you look at the market share figures for new 5G, it's absolutely true European companies don't get much in China, but on the new figures, Chinese companies are getting less than in the past outside of China. So there's a degree of decoupling happening. I do think we have to be careful about this. I'm not saying that it's wrong. These decisions that have been taken are necessarily wrong, but I think we have to just work out where it could take us if there was too much decoupling between China and the West in all aspects of future technology development. Because if we have two offers in the future, a West offer and a Chinese offer, you have to ask, what is the rest of the world going to be buying?
Not to mention that we can also ask the question how the cyberspace itself will exist in this fragmented version. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for this debate. I think it was an excellent hour. Unfortunately, we ran out of the time, even though I think we could continue for at least a few more hours. So thank you so much for participating. Thank you for enabling us to continue with Cybersec even under those difficult circumstances. I would like to also thank our participants. We have more than 270 people online joining us. So thank you so much for that. And I would like to give the floor to Basia to maybe tell us what will happen next. Thank you so much one more time for this discussion, and have a great day.